Thank you. Can you hear me? That's loud and clear. After the Week, in May 1945, the writer and publisher associated with the Bloomsbury Group, John Lehman, gathered poetry and writings from Britain and abroad under the title New Writing and Daylight. Now, clearly, daylight meant the metaphoric opposite of darkness, of war, and coming into daylight. Of the experience of breaking old habits associated with wartime, he wrote, "We are still dazed. We still find we are reluctant to recognize the fate of peace and to assess the kind of world the earthquake has left us to live in, the kind of Britain, the kind of Europe to which Britain, the Janus country, must with one face always look for partnership. And the most urgent of all questions is, can Europe find an integration of thought and belief that will prevent it from further near mortal strokes? And if so, by what strength and from what source?" I felt I had to quote that. While his words sadly resonate with our current political climate, we have to differentiate our troubling times from the existential trauma of post-war Britain and Europe. For in the wake of the defeat of Nazi Germany and the ongoing threat of an authoritarian Soviet Union, like many anti-fascist intellectuals of the time, Lehman sought a complex and nuanced form of Western democracy. Such conditions would enable free philosophical inquiry and political associations, a balance between government and people, between tradition and creative impulse, a state in which, and I quote, ethical scruples and metaphysical perplexities play a never negligible part. Britain had a political and cultural mission of spiritual reconciliation with a ruined Europe, and one that was loosely defined by the émigré Arthur Koestler in his recently published essays, The Yogi and the Commissar, that was recently in 1945, I should say, as a Western revolutionary humanism, a truly socialist movement and antidote to Russian pseudo-communism. There are several reasons for introducing my paper with this watershed volume of essays and poetry. First, it included submissions, not only from British authors such as Edith Sitwell and Stephen Spender, but also from émigrés and continentals. Second, although Lehman seized on the art of poetry in England as the flag bearer of a new European humanism, he gave space to the visual arts, theatre, film, and dance. Third, it contains early writing of the art historian and critic, Joseph Paul Hodin, in Britain, that reveals common ground with this literary circle, albeit nuanced by a Central European epistemological framework. In his essay on Oscar Kokoschka, Hodin focused on the artist's series of political pictures that were painted in exile. He linked Kokoschka's activist humanism, the foregoing of his Austrian citizenship, in favour of a Czech passport, to the mission of the 17th century Czech philosopher and educator John Amos Comenius. Hodin's Jewish heritage, Prague-born origins, and commitment to the Czechoslovak government in exile embedded him in the task of combating brutal nationalism via the Pansophic creed of Comenius, Cosmopolitan, we are all citizens of the world. As an émigré art historian who had lived in Czechoslovakia, Germany, France, and Sweden before fleeing to England in 1944, Hodin had insight into artistic and intellectual circles across Europe and Scandinavia. Indeed, as Alexandra Lazar has shown in her cataloguing of his estate in the Tate archive, notwithstanding Cold War politics, Hodin bridged the divide between East and West and was an active participant at the international congresses of art criticism and aesthetics organized by the Association Internationale de Critique d'Art, AICA. As you see, there is a brochure there from a rather later one in Poland, 1975. At the heart of this paper, and I'll just give you reference to some numerous journals that he contributed to on the right. At the heart of this paper, I trace Hodin's shift from art historian to critic, the ideas of which evolved in the 1950s. He brought a dynamic energy to this role, one that is borne out by the manner in which he conducted interviews with artists and observed the creative process according to a method he defined as a living art criticism. The art historian Rachel Smith has shown how Hodin distributed questionnaires to artists associated with St. Ives, with a view to publishing a major article on his findings in the Studio magazine. While the latter did not come to fruition, Smith examined the responses of 11 artists that testify to Hodin's efforts to formulate his project. Interestingly, to this effect, in the case of his encounter with Ludwig and Elsa Meidner, I focus on Hodin's use of an unnamed photographer to document the proceedings. What role did these photographs serve in Hodin's critical practice, and how did they relate to contemporary photographers' intrigue with the theme of portraiture of modern writers and artists in the studio or domestic setting? Prior to examining these factors, I've selected examples of Hodin's early writing so as to chart his theoretical turn. In the immediate post-war years, Hodin published a monograph on Munch in Swedish, and as in the case of émigré art historian Edith Hoffman, brought Expressionism to the attention of a British audience. He contributed the essay Expressionism to the notable magazine Horizon, an arts and literary review, published monthly in London between December 1939 and January 1950. Here, he revealed his penchant for a theory of aesthetics as lying in modern psychology, and familiar with the art historical writing of Heinrich Wölfflin and Wilhelm Wöhringer, Hodin advanced the relationship between style and personality. Suspicious of artistic schools and collectives, he nonetheless argued that the creative processes have their source in the unconscious. He seized on the work of the Czech-born, though clearly main contributor to the Viennese school, Max Dvorak, who saw the history of art as the history of spirit, and who remained suspicious of the materialist outlook of natural science. Via these means, Hodin claimed that Courtauld, for instance, in his portraiture, in view of the spiritual conflicts of his generation, and I quote, penetrates far below the surface in an attempt to interpret the psychological states in relation to their mysterious moorings deep in the human psyche. Clearly, he's referring to Freud there. If we detect in this text an impassioned form of Geistesgeschichte that is Spenglerian in its methodology of viewing art and art criticism against the larger issues of the malaise of modern culture and science, then within a matter of a year, we detect signs of transformation in his theoretical position. No doubt valued for his internationalism and adaptability, in March 1949, Hodin was appointed the first librarian and director of studies of the Institute of Contemporary Art, a position he held until 1954, Established by Roland Penrose and Herbert Reed, among others, by 1951, the ICA was based in 17 Dover Street, Piccadilly, and was dedicated to an active program of exhibitions, lectures, discussions, and film performances. And there in that you could see a course outline that he's provided, a course in contemporary art for year 1951 and thereafter. In December 1950, in correspondence with the editor of the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Hodin communicated the news of this appointment and expressed the hope of doing something towards introducing the wide range of contemporary empirical and realistic aesthetics into England. For this, the assistance of such a body as the American Society for Aesthetics will be invaluable, he said. Indeed, in examining Herbert Reed's philosophy of modern art, Hodin claimed, it must be mentioned here that a science of art, in the sense of the German Kunstwissenschaft, with its discipline and laboratory work, does not exist in England. Hodin was one of many émigré art historians who turned to wide-ranging empirical studies as a means of resistance to Nazi ideological methodologies that had hijacked the discipline. As he argued in an essay of 1955, Art History, or the History of Culture, a contemporary German problem, recent publications in Germany were the product, he said, of a struggle between a nationalist ideal, which has dominated intellectual life in Germany for decades, and a unitary European attitude. Here he mentioned, of course, Hans Sedlmayr's ideas in the book Verlust der Mitte, The Loss of Centre, 1948, with its clinging to an anti-modern world order of man as an image of God, received, and here this received equally short shrift. In place of God's ordered universe, Hodin called on German art historians to reject cultural pessimism in favor of a humanistic interpretation of science. Here he advised Sedlmayr to consult the writings of contemporary physicists Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, and Albert Einstein in order to gauge changing conceptions of the world. Hodin's empirical turn, though, must also be considered in light of his interaction with the British art world, since his second wife, Pamela Sims, inherited a house in Carbis Bay. He and his family spent much time there. He thus became closely involved with a group of artists and sculptors, Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, Bernard Leach, and Ben Nicholson, who were associated with or settled in St. Ives at the outbreak of World War II. Summarizing his views in a paper entitled The Empirical Approach to Aesthetic Problems in Modern Art, whether dealing with geometric or organic abstraction, Hodin proposed that the art critic's quest was governed by the scientific imperative. Thereby, modern art was considered a natural phenomenon, and, with Goethe as a referent, the aesthetician should take part in the living process, not only through contemplating the works, but also through personal contact with artists by visiting their studios, conducting interviews, and examining their writings. In this, he added that a detailed analysis of structure, composition, technical methods, and materials was required when engaging with new emerging art forms. He mentions Taschism and abstract expressionism there. Art historian Judith Walsh contends that it was through this approach of deploying scientific reasoning as a method of art criticism that Hodin engaged with the notion of the real and reality in British art in the 1950s. publications were wide-ranging, spanning classic modernists, emigre connections, and contemporary manifestations, whether abstract or figural. During his stint at the ICA, he received a letter of introduction from fellow exile Ludwig Meidner. It is a fascinating and multi-layered document, which was obviously written in German, and which reveals the themes of the conference through the prism of the artist's eventual remigration, his reasons for approaching Hodin, their meeting and subsequent interaction across transnational boundaries. From your publications, I see that you're also interested in German Expressionism. A special exhibition of the Berlin Burka at the last Venice Biennale has taken place. There I saw the same selection in winter at the Kunstsalon Möller in Cologne. They made an excellent impression. This is still very formal. The undersigned, Ludwig Meidner, a member of Burka generation, who was friends with them but followed a different trend in those years before the First World War, also produced works no less than the paintings of the Burka. Unfortunately, in later years, I devoted myself to literature, but here in London, in emigration, I worked artistically again, as far as was possible under the prevailing circumstances. If you would like to see something of my current production, please come visit me, sir. It is definitely worth looking at. A prolific correspondent, Meidner's letters are well versed in the formalities of complimenting the recipient prior to calling upon their services. While addressed in London, we learned that he was concerned with cultural matters, not in his adoptive abode, but back in Germany, where he visited briefly in 1952. As an Orthodox Jew, what led him to the unthinkable? After all, in January 1940, writing of the separation from homeland, he confided, "And this disdainful fatherland is yet now for us no longer a fatherland, but in the memory, a treacherous stepfatherland, to which I never want to return, not even as a guest." He and his wife, Elsa Meidner, fled Cologne in August 1939, and from the outset, their situation was precarious. Elsa worked in Sydenham as a house servant. And Ludwig attempted all means of professional viability in London after his internment. This included an application for permission from the Home Office via the Jewish Refugees Committee, that's of 1942, to work on his own account as a portrait painter during his period of stay in the country. Clearly, portrait painting was the bread and butter of such an artist. Yet his list of paintings and drawings, produced on commission between 1939 and 1949, is woefully thin. The most lucrative, for £100, being the second portrait of the Rabbi Dr. Leo Beck, painted between 1946 and 1948, which was commissioned by the London Leo Beck Lodge of the B'nai B'rith. In 1949, a joint exhibition of his and Elsa Meidner's works held at the Ben-Uri Gallery, and here they situated against a backdrop of some of Elsa Meidner's works, did not, moreover, result in a lasting improvement of their situation. Understandably then, in December 1952, following several invitations of the then senior public prosecutor Ernst Courtauld, Meidner travelled to Hamburg. During the sojourn, as a guest of the SPD politician Adolf Arndt in Bonn, the artist received an official portrait commission from the Bundespräsident Theodor Heuss. You see him up on the left, who had previously commissioned another well-known exile, Oskar Kokoschka, to do likewise. Amidst much debate, the founder of the CDU party and architect of West Germany's post-war reconstruction, Adenauer, adopted an approach of Wiedergutmachung, reflecting a particular ethical path of dealing with the past, one which involved the recognition of the right of return of German Jews. In some cases, critics invited former residents to return, as in 1948, when the city of Frankfurt Main extended such invitations to Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Evidently, Meidner's visit apprised him of the Federal Republic's efforts to present itself not according to notions of the Stunde Null, but as a continuity of a modern living form of German Kulturnation, which eclipsed the world wars and two collapsed political systems. In 1952, for the National Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, Eberhard Hamstengel collected paintings of the artists associated with the Brücke from the period 1907 to 1922. Instructively, many of the loans were derived from the collection of the art dealer Ferdinand Müller, who, as you know, was one of the 4 art dealers who were permitted and given license to sell degenerate art. And so, having witnessed the Brücke artists, and that's the gallery Ferdinand Müller, Meidner saw an art historical niche for his pre-1914 oeuvre and elicited Hodin's attention via this genealogy to his current production in exile. In his monograph on Meidner, Hodin expressed disbelief that after 9 years in exile, he had only just discovered the well-known expressionist presence in Finchley, not too distant from the art critic's home in Hampstead. Yet the contrast between their respective fates in exile could not have been more explicit. The photographic material of their meeting consists of 38 negatives, as well as a selection of photographs thereof, which you see some on the right of the studio, including Meidner's works, some of which he had brought together with him in 1939. And they include the major portrait on your left-hand side in the studio of Max Hermann Neisser of 1920. Collectively, they disclose the visual acuity and gaze of the anonymous photographer. They are compositionally challenging, making use of stark contrasts of natural life, both in and out of doors. In juxtaposing portraiture, oeuvre, and domestic clutter, the photographs invite the viewer to dwell on the sitter's relationship to their environment, as well as intensifying the intimacy between the photographer and the humble subject. Certainly Hodin was acquainted with the émigré photographer Ida Carr, whom he commissioned in the 1960s. You see in the photograph in front of you. Carr focused on monumentally engaging portraits of modern artists, sculptors, and writers in interiors, as worthy of display in their own right. She was a pioneer in this regard, and her first solo exhibition, 40 Artists from Paris and London, was launched in her husband's, Victor Musgrave's, Gallery 1 in Soho in 1954. Nevertheless, the height of her success was the well-received Whitechapel Gallery one-person show in 1960. Just by way of interlude, I introduced her photographs of Theodor Garman, those were the early 1950s, and the painter's son of Jakob Epstein. Yet the photographs of the Meidner couple served as part and parcel of the art critic's tools in assembling evidence. There are no markings or stamps on the rear, except in the case of 2 shots, which I'll show you in a moment, where Hodin had written notes in German. Instructively, these amplify on the creative process. As he later noted, Hodin later noted of this interview, once I came in the middle of the day, I wanted to have photographs made. And to do this, we needed as much light as possible in the room, which was gloomy, even in the daytime. Since I desperately wanted a photograph of Meidner at work, we carried out his drawing board, put it on a chair, and he began to draw. The photographs show his way of working very clearly. There we are. He began to draw a head, not with the outer contour, but drawn from the inside out, and I hope you can make this out, past the fuzzy contour of his rear view. He put in the eye, which is the light and window of the soul, and worked from there, following the traces and adjacent planes, always shading and so giving depth before he gives contour and demarcates the volumes against each other. He did not seem to be satisfied with the results, however, so I had once again to sit in the electrically lit room on one of the following evenings. Clearly there were more than one sittings. In addition to the critics' anecdotal account of time, place and temperament of the artist, the photographs serve as the departure for Hodin's appraisal of the draftsmanship in giving shape to the evolving portrait. The serial nature of the photographic exercise did justice to Hodin's methodology of living art criticism. Wittingly or unwittingly, the empirical basis of his project gave testimony to both the penury and human dignity of creativity in exile. There was an afterlife for these photographs, but with different outcomes. Just read In August 1953, Meidner returned to Germany permanently. He initially settled in Frankfurt's Jewish retirement home, along with 50 co-lodgers, so he informed Hodin. Significant here was the fact that the Hessian State Minister of Finance, Heinrich Kluge, was very receptive to Meidner's claim for reparations. In 1955, he moved to Marxheim, a part of the city of Hochheim am Taunus, where the dealer, Hanno Becker von Rath, secured a studio for him at a fraction of the former rental. Rath, who was well known for safeguarding a private collection of degenerate art throughout the Reich, was another conduit for the artist's re-entry into the public sphere. Indeed, the journalist Hans Stahl visited the studio in 1956 and published an essay which announced the rediscovery of an old master of German expressionism in the seclusion of a village in Hesse. Fortunately, Stahl was accompanied by the 28-year-old photographer Stefan Moses, whose photo series graphically portrayed the alterity of the elderly Jewish artist. But it was the admiration of Meidner's early career, the apocalyptic-laden city landscapes, expressionist self-portraits and graphic works that dominated exhibition planning, particularly the commemoration of his 80th birthday. On this occasion, 200 of his works travelled from the Kunsthalle in Recklinghausen to the Haus am Waldsee in Berlin, and thereafter to the Kunsthalle in Darmstadt. As a reviewer commented, it was the historic Meidner, as avant-gardist, that is between 1910 to 20, that the curators were interested in, to the exclusion of the contemporary, more reassured artists. It goes without saying that the works relating to his 14 years in exile were entirely omitted from exhibitions in his lifetime. But following his death in early 1966, the Darmstädter Tagblatt commissioned Hodin, to write an illustrated series of 5 articles devoted to Ludwig Meidner's London Jahr. Reframed in this context, the photographic series loses its coherence and the frisson associated with its time and place. I'll just quickly show you some of the others. Moreover, while they are provided with captions, their function is unanchored in Hodin's narrative and divorced from its critical apparatus. In view of its constituencies and readership, though, Hodin's analysis was astute, reminding a German audience of the hardships of life in exile and Meidner's artistic responses, which he talks about there, to the crimes of the Holocaust. Indeed, as relayed in a paper in 2013 by Rachel Dixon and Sarah McDougall, Hodin's own research over the last decade into, and I quote, the problem of Jewish art and its contemporary aspect, Hodin attempted to promote an allegiance of cultural experiences between modern German and Jewish artists. And I quote, it raises more problems than it resolves, but that's by nature of Hodin's approach. Strange how related the German and Jewish artists are in the world. Only the Jews in art started much later. The German master can draw on a tradition of several hundred years. Now he goes on to add further problems. Actually, the Germans also came late in relation to the Latin connections. So, of course, such musings require serious interrogation. But they raise insights into Hodin's curiosity and utopianism, imposing questions that erode boundaries. And given that the Gesellschaft für Exilforschung, that is in Germany, was only founded in 1984, and a selective showing of Meidner's exile works in 1991, and then only recently in 2016, Hodin's writings and activities make valuable and provocative interventions in the historiography of the period. Thank you.